I am a representative of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, for Latin America, based in Mexico City. And then I thank the Strelka Institute emphatically for this opportunity and for the interest in knowing more about the patterns of territorial governance in Mexico over the last 2 decades, and the way in which the OECD has been studying and analyzing and prescribing advice to the government of Mexico, but also to the governments of states. As you know, Mexico is a federal country, and so we have a federal government, and the state governments have their own authority and their own responsibility towards the citizens. And so in that sense, the OECD has been having a productive dialogue with both the national federal government as well as with state governments. And so that's my presentation. So I'll be starting with the fact that the OECD has developed an extensive global expertise in the analysis of the drivers of metropolitan areas around the globe, and also the challenges that cities and regions face, given that the globalization process affects cities and regions the most. And so, as we all know, we live in a highly interconnected and increasingly complex world. And we have one big challenge, and that's something that the OECD has taken seriously, and that is that our toolkit to analyze global phenomena and the way in which these phenomena affect cities and regions is quite limited. So we no longer have full confidence in the traditional way to analyze regions and cities and global forces. Therefore, we need to develop an enhanced grasp and a new toolkit with more perspectives, not only the economic perspective, but also the anthropology perspective, the sociology perspective, the social perspective, and also the complex public management perspective, amongst other disciplines. And so it's easier said than done, but we know that the challenges are enormous. And so we have migration, we have climate change, and we have, of course, the very rapid growth of cities into monstrous urban spaces that we call metropolitan areas, or even mega cities. And therefore, one key aspect of the quick growth of cities to the OECD and many experts is the secondary effects of urban growth, namely the unfortunate increase in inequality. And we see that more so, we are sort of used to see inequality in emerging countries or in developing countries, but I should tell you that the OECD has found that there's been a growing tide of inequality in advanced economies as well. And therefore, it's no surprise that there's been a growing interest, and you can see that historical trend over there from 1951 to the year 2010, on ways in which governance of cities can be improved. Knowing, of course, or taking as a key first baseline the fact that the governance of cities is ever more complex, and there's more actors and more stakeholders involved, and therefore metropolitan governance is here to stay, not only as a fashion expression, but as a stark reality in the ways that governments need to tackle the challenges that I just mentioned. And so, in the case of Mexico, and this is going to be a quick, let's see, an outlook on how territorial and urban policies have evolved. And I should say that Mexico has changed deeply, and it has moved or shifted from being a highly centralized country to being a polycentric country. So, for example, in the 1950s, going to the trend that I mentioned before, there was a steady flow of migration from around the country, Mexico, going from all regions and all places towards Mexico City or the central part of Mexico. And so that changed in the last 2 decades. I would say in the last 3 decades, but there was one key aspect of this change, and that was productive transformation and the establishment or the beginning of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so as we used to know it, NAFTA was a powerful force driving economic productive transformation in Mexico. And you can see there how trade between, mostly between Mexico and the United States grew almost 7 times since the beginning of NAFTA. And NAFTA had a profound impact in the economic evolution of Mexico, because what it did is that it made Mexico, or transformed Mexico, or the Mexican economy, into a manufacturing powerhouse. And you can see there the share of Mexico's exports and the composition of the exports compared to the exports of other countries. And you see that Mexico is the champion of Latin America in the export of manufactured products. And so that sounds good. I mean, it sounds competitive because it confirms the narrative of the economic paradigm or the economic bet that was placed on the future of Mexico when NAFTA was enacted back in you remember that in 95. And then the other interesting thing about NAFTA and how it transformed the Mexican economy is that it inserted Mexico into what we call global value chains, and that is complex networks of global production that are dispersed throughout the globe. And you can see there, for example, Mexico, and you see that more solid blue segment of that in that graphic, the column, and you see that Mexico has more backward participation. So in this game of global value chains, that says that Mexico receives a lot of inputs from other countries, namely in some sectors, namely the U.S. For example, in the automotive and the auto parts industry, inputs or components came from the U.S. into Mexico, and then Mexico would export back to the U.S. With cars and finished products. And so that's what we see as backward participation, and we see the Russian Federation in that graph. And that's interesting because the Russian Federation has a much lower rate of backward participation into global value chains. What it means is that, and you know better than I, that Russia was exporting to the rest of global value chains more than what it imported in terms of inputs. And so you can guess better than I'm only guessing, but you know better than I do, that it was mostly primary products in the primary sector, extractive industries, and so those primary inputs of other more complex chains of production. And you see Germany there and other countries that have a higher degree of imports, like inputs to process and then to send to other markets as more finished or semi-finished products. And what the NAFTA process did to Mexico in terms of the geography of Mexico and the distribution of migration, the flux of people, the inflows and outflows of people between cities, is that you see these cities near the US-Mexico border, and that tells you how Mexico had experienced a boom of low-wage, not very sophisticated manufacturing processes. In different sectors, for example, in the retail, in the apparel, the clothes sector, and also in other manufacturing sectors. So Mexico received imports. It added value, namely labor, which was low wage, and then re-exported more finished products. And that in Spanish is known, and even in English, is known as the maquiladora. Maquiladoras are these sweatshops that process raw materials and inputs, and then you finish a product, and then you send it back to other markets, or you re-export it to other markets. And you can see the growth of cities like in the north, like Tijuana, right next to San Diego along the US-Mexico border. You see El Paso, which is also in the US-Mexico border. And so it was this logistical advantage of some US companies to relocate or to move operations on the Mexican side, but close to the US. And so that was the model, the generic model from which NAFTA took off initially. And then you see that in some sectors, such as the automotive and auto parts, the trend was such that, interestingly enough, Mexico and some cities that you see over there that are not only in the northern part of Mexico, but also in the central and central western part of Mexico, you see that gradually production in Mexico started to become more sophisticated or more complex. And so that means that state governments, along with city governments, were successful in providing or in escalating the type of production and added value that was brought into the picture for some more complex ramifications of global value chains. And so that's interesting, because then you see how some cities, not only in the north, but also in these cities in the central and central western part of the country, became bigger, became attractive to many people who wanted to get better jobs, or people who were displaced from more traditional economic activities. And so in that sense, you see that we start to witness over the last 25 years, or seemingly, that there's less centralization in Mexico and more the emergence of regional hubs of economic activity. And of course, there's a competition between regions of Mexico to lure investment in sectors. And what happened eventually is that in some parts of the north of Mexico, and in some parts in the western part of Mexico too, the sophistication of economic operations and the added value that Mexico added into global value chains started to increase. And so from automobile and auto parts, Mexico started to attract investment into sectors such as the aerospace sector. And so you started to gain the attention and to have investors, multinationals such as Bombardier in Europe, or Boeing in the US, or Honeywell, or GE, to establish operations in Mexico for more sophisticated products into airplanes, for example. And so that added to the trend of cities becoming more attractive outside of Mexico City. What we see in the OECD is that this was good, because, I mean, of course, there were very impressive figures of higher foreign direct investment flowing into Mexico, but there was a secondary effect to that. And that we can see on the left side of this graph, that from 2005 to 2014, there's a very dramatic and growing gap between the five fastest growing states of Mexico compared to the five slowest growing state of Mexico, or the laggards, if you will. And so for some, through this very complex process of economic liberalization and specialization of regions in Mexico, there was an unintended effect of growing inequality across regions and across states in Mexico. And so that added pressure to, decision makers began to wonder what could be done, and they realized that that better methodologies, that new analytic tools needed to be brought about in order to improve or enhance territorial governance in Mexico in face of these trends that I just outlined. And so you see the work of the OECD here. There's the the front covers of several reports on territorial governance. And for example, on the left-hand side, you see the territorial review of the Valley of Mexico, which stretches beyond Mexico City now and reaches out to the neighboring state of Mexico. You see territorial reviews of states of Mexico. For example, that's the big state in Mexico, Chihuahua, next to the US border, is as large, I believe, as Great Britain. So it's a very large territory for that matter. And so you see also a review of an interesting region near neighboring Mexico City, combining two states, and the states are Puebla and Tlaxcala, funny Mexican words. But anyway, so those two states are important because one of them, Puebla, is much stronger economically than Tlaxcala, but Puebla is a champion of automotive production in Mexico and in North America. It's the hub of the production of cars for Volkswagen and Audi, German cars. And then the territorial review of the state of Morelos in the southern part of Mexico City, which is a more agricultural state, but it wants to evolve into more complex economic activities beyond agriculture and the basic sectors. And then there's the more recent review of the state of Hidalgo, which was launched May the 2nd this year. And Hidalgo is also a neighboring state of Mexico City. And all of this to say that we foresee that eventually we'll be doing a review of the whole region, combining all these states into one mega region of Mexico. And so that's part of the logic in which the OECD operates, and that is to accompany the development of strategies that need not be just about the OECD coming, stopping, and telling some recommendations and then flying away, but in terms of being close to the governments to do more upon previous recommendations. So the OECD identifies 26 metro areas in Mexico, 20 of which are covered by a governance body that is a representative, inclusive political consultation mechanism with multiple stakeholders. This is important because this is the building block of the flow of federal funds, federal resources, budget resources, into state and metro areas, but metropolitan areas specifically. So beginning in 2006, Mexico developed definitions of 59 metropolitan areas and introduced special funds that are disbursed to them, as I mentioned just before. And then these councils, metropolitan councils, were created by state governments to allocate the funds. And then in most cases, what's interesting about the Mexican case is that in most OECD countries, the local governments are very involved in the execution of national funds. But in the case of Mexico, that's not the pattern. the pattern is that the state governments or regional governments are more powerful than the local governments. And there was a political reason to that, and that is that until very recently, the mayors of cities were not allowed to be re-elected, and so they could be in office only 3 years. And so recently there was a political reform, and now the mayors can be re-elected so as to reach 6 years in office maximum. And so that changes the dashboard of how political representation matches funding, and now the local governments will become stronger in terms of the possibility of getting funding and executing federal budget. So 7 Mexican metropolitan areas are even entirely contained within one municipality. So that means that some medium to large cities in Mexico, 7 of them, are contained within one single local government, and that's good because it makes it quite simple to manage cities. But the largest cities in Mexico are different, and so that means that you see within one city several local governments, and they're not boroughs. They used to be boroughs, which are administrative entities, but now there was, because of this new political reform in Mexico, now they are full local governments, elected governments. And so, so that changed in 2013, so that's recent. And one of the key results that we expect from that reform is that a big problem in the past was that because of the 3 years time frame, there was not enough time for the professionalization of local government officials. And so now we expect that gradually there will be more permanence in office for local officials. So interestingly enough, federal agencies have been absent from the management of cities in Mexico, except for Mexico City. Mexico City was the exception because of its size. You probably know that the metro area of Mexico City has 24 million inhabitants, and that's a huge number. And so in that case, there's federal agencies coordinated with the government of Mexico City and the other local governments surrounding it. But that was the exception. But then after 2018, when the new government came into office, that's bound to change. And so there's going to be more federal involvement, federal agencies coordinating with local municipal governments. And so that's really new. We're still yet to see how that operates. And so the case of Mexico City since 2013, I mentioned. So that's why the OECD did this governance review 2.5 years ago in order to identify the key components of this new mechanism that emerged in 2013 so as to improve coordinated governance across the federal agencies that had to do with housing, the environment, mobility, water management, together with the state governments of Mexico City, the neighboring state of Mexico, mainly the state of Mexico, not other governments yet. And then because there was a new political reform 2 years ago in 2016, 3 years ago, the Mexico City government changed, and so for the first time the local boroughs inside Mexico City became municipal governments. So that adds to some key recommendations that were given by the OECD in terms of, yes, giving more power to the local city councils, the new municipalities, and also making sure that there was a stronger emphasis on coordinated infrastructure planning in mobility and in water management. And so as to the Puebla-Tlaxcala case in the states that I mentioned as an example of the way that they've been successful in attracting investment in the automotive and auto parts sector, what happens in that region is that, as I said before, inequality has not being tackled. And then the human factor is it weighs heavily on the future of that region, because the ironic fact is that they have one of the highest number of universities in that region, yet they have a large critical mass of people without the necessary skills to thrive and to add value to the escalation of complexity into the automotive and auto parts sectors in that region. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the limited municipal capacity because of the lack of permanence of local government officials, administrative fragmentation. So again, that's an example, and that's the case of other regions as well, where you see metropolitan challenges without metropolitan solutions. So that's the case I just mentioned. Despite the assets that I mentioned also briefly, in terms of, the demographics are very, young population, universities and the like. But that's again, the challenges are outlined there. So this is just to give you an idea of how the urban footprint has been expanding in that metropolitan, evolving, emerging metropolitan area of the city of Puebla and the neighboring state of Tlaxcala. So one of the things that the OECD has been insisting, not only in this case, but in several cases across Mexico, is the urgency to modernize all of the regulations behind land use, the use of land. And so there's outdated records, there's lack of technology, and there's opacity in the management of property rights according to the use of land and the regulation of the use of land. And then, of course, transportation is always an issue in growing metro areas. Big challenges in that area as well. And so this is just to give you more granularity into what I just mentioned in terms of how the OECD makes detailed recommendations on what needs to be done. Interestingly enough, there's a new governor in the state of both Puebla, and there's a governor that has been in office for 2 years and a half in the state of Tlaxcala, and we've had very good feedback from them as new governments, and saying to us that they used our review as a baseline, like an input, a key input to their state development plans. And so that's to us, that's a reason to be satisfied. So now entering into the core and final segment of this presentation, as you probably heard that we had in Mexico presidential elections last July 1st, July the 2nd, sorry. And then the new government initiated office December 1st of 2018. And so the new government has been in office for 9 months. And this new government is of a completely new political party, so that's not unique, because we've seen that in other countries, in Europe, even in Europe. And so you have people who have movements and that are not parties, but they're new party-like political organizations. And so the current president is emerged from one of these movements, left-wing government. And so there's been a big shift in the paradigm through which the new government, the new federal administration in Mexico is putting forth a new narrative of what Mexico should do in order to grow. And then there's been this sharp rhetoric by Mexico's president that his government is it completely departs from the previous federal administrations that are labeled as neoliberal. And so the new government portrays itself as a government that will respond to social issues, and that has to, the main goal is to redress inequality, to reverse inequality, and to disburse budget resources to social programs that will not be deployed through intermediate organizations. And so that's very interesting, because that means in practice that the federal government is now centralizing its control of budget resources and taking that control away from local, but especially away from state governments. And so we are seeing, as we speak, in the last 9 months, a centralization of the federal budget into the hands of federal agencies. And so that's a bit of bad news to governors, but now the governors have to negotiate in new and creative ways with Mexico's president. And so we are still to see what happens with Mexico City, because since 2013, we have this, as I said, coordination between federal agencies and now with the local governments that are independent and elected. And then one key takeaway, one key factor is that the mayor of Mexico City belongs to the same political movement as the president. And so that's good news, because there will not be a struggle between the federal government and Mexico City. One thing that is crucial to mention is that the National Development Plan in Mexico, in all of the previous administrations for decades, was a detailed technical plan containing goals and objectives and indicators and performance metrics and timelines for execution, and now that is no longer the case. And so we were astonished in Mexico to see that the new National Development Plan of the new government is no longer a detailed plan, as we know in anywhere. So it's more a vision statement of the new National Development Strategy, but for some people that's not enough, and there's been a very heated debate as to what will replace the good old methodology of setting objectives, goals, timelines, indicators. And so that's why we are very eager now to see the new sectoral development strategies in Mexico, because that's where we expect to have all that detail, all that planning, all that, the management and the commitments and the deliverables and the timelines. And so I mentioned this because in the case of urban and territorial development, that is the situation. And so the government is set to have the National Territorial and Urban Development Strategy ready by January 2020. And so what the government does have at this point is, and that's a part of the new paradigm and the new narrative of the new administration in Mexico, is that you have, the promise was from the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that you would see an effective government in the delivery of programs and funds and resources to vulnerable groups and vulnerable areas. And this is important because we don't have the National Territorial and Urban Development Strategy, but we do have a program for the improvement of cities. And so you see in this map priority cities that have been selected by the current government to be targeted with additional special federal resources in 3 areas. And you see, for example, you have Tijuana in the border, and that's interesting to me because I think that there's, and I'll mention this in more detail, but the thing is the 3 areas that I mentioned were, first is the improvement of public spaces in cities, and especially in areas of cities that are inhabited by vulnerable groups and low-income groups. And so there's this social focus on vulnerable areas and vulnerable groups in cities. The other component of this new city improvement strategy is the improvement of housing, so that people live in better households, in better homes. And the third component is, as I mentioned before, to address the challenge of suboptimal management of the regulation of the use of land and the use of spaces in cities. And so, for example, Tijuana has been selected because it's right next to the border with the US, but as I said before, because it is perceived, Tijuana, as a city that suffered from the collateral negative effects of the low-wage, maquiladora, assembly plant economic regional model. And so this is like a recognition that there's a new strategy that needs to be deployed, especially in those areas that suffered from the collateral effects of the integration of Mexico into the North American economic space. And so what you see there, it's interesting because you see there's a wall that's been there for over 2 decades, and so that's not we're not giving credit to any particular administration in the US for that. So that was something that was built together by Mexico and the US. But you can see there on the left-hand side that it goes all the way to the sea. And so there's this physical barrier. And you see also on that lower picture over there that on the left-hand side there's the US, it's the United States territory. On the right-hand side it's Mexican, the city of Tijuana. And there's, on the left-hand side, there's the city of San Diego. And San Diego is one of the wealthiest, richest, more prosperous cities in the whole of the United States. And so the contrast between the two areas cannot be exaggerated. And so in that sense, what seems interesting, and that's part of the things that we will see, is that the two cities, San Diego and Tijuana, have grown in such a way that you can, if you fly over the area, you can see easily that it's one metropolitan area divided into 2 dimensions and 2 separate, distinct realities. And so it seems that in the medium run, there might be an effort on the 2 sides, a cross-border effort, to begin planning in a coordinated manner so that we see the emergence of San Diego, Tijuana metropolitan development strategy. So stay tuned. That would be fantastic if that happens soon. And so I mentioned that the new government is focused on carrying out programs such as the already mentioned Urban Improvement Program. The National Sectoral Plan on Territorial and Urban Development is still to be completed by January 2020 as a commitment made to the Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Finance is very powerful in Mexico. It's like a super ministry. And then the vision for the new plan is to set goals and objectives to relate to well-being indicators as a bottom line. This is in line with the presidential mandate to prioritize social indicators as the yardstick of impact of the new national strategy. And then a national consultation process is still happening in order to be fine-tuned with experts to establish social impact indicators on the performance of the new national territorial and urban development plan. And those indicators are expected to be ready by 2019. And so federal government has been telling this to me because they expect the OECD to become involved. And so this is my general overview. Those are my contact details. I hope I've been disciplined in the use of time so as to allow for probably questions that you might have in a dialogue, in a more interactive session. So Well, thank you for the time being, and I'm open to whatever feedback, and that's priceless to the OECD emerging from you in this session. So thank you for being here with me.